Good evening, my name is Evan Ferch here again with the SimmonsReview.com for our weekly news recap, where we dig a little bit deeper into some of the headline news of the week. With me as always is Dr. Terry Simmons. Tonight we also have a special guest, Keith Palmer, former student of Terry's, who's sort of here to sort of give his perspective on issues discussed this week. Well, let's start. The UN General Assembly was in town in New York this past week, which has highlighted cold relations, so to speak, between the Soviet Union and the United States, especially concerning Syria. So, Dr. Simmons, if you could sort of give everyone a little bit of an update on what's happening with the Russian participation in the Syrian situation.
Well, Syria has been a long time client state of the Soviet Union and now the Russian Federation. And Vladimir Putin has been there for both versions of that. And he has made a statement. He's come to the front and has said they're a client state, we owe them our support, and we're going to continue to prop up and support the Assad regime, because technically he's only in control of about 16 to 20% of his country right now. So his days could be numbered, and I think without Russian support they would be numbered. Mm-hmm. The friction between the Americans and the Russians are that Putin is pretty much taking over the scene. He's taking charge and kind of excluding the Americans, and of course the Americans want to be part of that. They're the ones that stood up the revolution against Assad. The demands have always been that Assad's got to go because of the atrocities. Yeah. He's already been convicted by the UN as being a war criminal. So they view him that way, and they demand that he be removed from the scene before we make any accommodation, political or military. So that's playing out right now. The friction is who's going to drive the bus right now.
I sort of see it as a bit of a philosophical friction between Putin and the West, or Putin and Obama, and sort of their general worldview, because we saw this with Putin's speech to the Assembly and in his interview with Charlie Rose on 60 Minutes, where he essentially came out against democracy as such, and basically made the argument that sort of in favor of autocracy, that with autocracy you get stability. You know, that was sort of his big criticism of the Arab Spring in general. These democratic movements, as they came back, as they arose and got rid of these autocratic dictatorships, the result has been largely chaos and death. And I guess, Keith, if you want to get on this too, do you think there's any validity in his argument that with autocracy you do get some measure of at least stability?
Well, I agree 100. I mean, I would say 100%, but I do agree, because I think that it's pretty obvious that a lot of what's going on when you've got rid of these dictators in the Middle East is that you have a vacuum.
Yeah.
And that vacuum is often filled by kind of the devil you know is actually better than the devil you don't know. And I don't even know if it's fully played out what we have going on there. 15, 20 years from now, I think we're actually going to know.
Yeah.
But I think there is some validity to what he's saying, because I don't even know if we know what we're up against over there.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's, we say that, there's the moderate groups or whatever. I don't know that we can really assess that accurately at this point.
That's a good point. I mean, democracy is such a new concept in that part of the world. I mean, the region has largely been ruled by autocracy for generations.
Well, if you look at their modus operandi, how the tribal system has worked, it's basically determined by the Sunni-Shia divide. That's the common denominator, the lowest common denominator. So when the Europeans first, through the colonial period, the Mandate period, when they came in and created states like Iraq, Syria, and the rest, it was imposed, and it was a fait accompli. But as time went on, and especially the Arab Spring, it was kind of put in their face and said, you should try this, and then it was forcefully done, and the United States helped to fund and create the atmosphere for that. And basically the Middle East as a whole, if you can make a sweeping generalization, has said, we really don't think democracy is of any use here. We don't have any use for it. So the Bush doctrine was pretty much abandoned. Iraq turned out to be a pretty big catastrophe, and it was only rescued by the surge in 2006. So We still have a lot of problems that are obvious now, and now the fait accompli is that the Russians have preempted and co-opted the situation and are running things.
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit of, I remember in the run-up to the Iraq War, maybe even the late 90s, there was some discussion of, yes, Saddam was a terrible dictator, what's the solution? Do we try to create a democratic uprising, or do we replace him with a different dictator?
Well, I like Joe Biden's solution. He said partition is natural. Why not go with it? Let Kurdistan evolve into a new state. Let the Sunni Triangle be Sunni, and let Basra be the center of the Shia empire, cooperating with Tehran. It was not a palatable democratic solution, but it was very ultimately sensible for that part of the world. But talking about it and doing it, as Professor Winslow explained to us quite well in one of our programs, is
two very different things.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, if you look back at American foreign policy, especially throughout the 20th century, I mean, in a lot of countries, we've allied ourselves with dictatorships, often military dictatorships like South America. You could argue in the interest of stability. Saddam was, and if you go back to the Middle East, I mean, Saddam was a horrendous tyrant, but Iraq was incredibly stable under his rule. He leaves, as Keith said, it creates a vacuum for power. So I guess, I don't know if you have any ideas about this. You see the West coming around to Putin's position as chaos continues?
Well, it's counterintuitive, but it does make sense what he's doing. He understands that. He has, we did a GWAT cooperation with the Russians. We know what the Islamic problem is. We've been cooperating and still are cooperating, even in the midst of these harsh polemics. We're still cooperating with the Russians. So they're trying to solve an internal problem and a foreign policy problem while Putin gets back into visibility. He wants to resurrect the empire, and he's well on his way to doing it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very good point. I know in a lot of your writings have described Putin's Russia as revanchist. I mean, that's he wants to bring, and he made reference to that in the 60 Minutes interview. He said, I believe it said the fall of the USSR was the worst thing to happen to Russia. I thought that was a very, very interesting comment.
Yeah, that was a bold statement. Didn't you write on this subject? It seems to me when you were one of my classes, you took a couple of classes from me, I remember.
Yeah, I believe so. This would have been a couple of years.
Yeah. It seems to me that this thing with Putin, that, in 2007, he basically said, and I'll go into this later in a different segment, but he basically said, we don't trust the Americans anymore. They made us a lot of promises. Mm-hmm. They're not coming to fruition. We look like we're being neo-contained again. It looks like the Cold War. So we're going to walk away. We're going to do our own thing. We're going to orient our thinking to the East, and we're going to walk away from the Americans. And when he walked away, he also said, we're going to seize decision-making power. Yeah. And I'll tell you, when he stood down over the Obama administration in 2013, over the Tomahawk missile attack, the gas attacks, he made a point, and it stuck, and he's still building on that point. So I see that Putin, he was nominated for Man of the Year a couple of times right after that. So he's wildly popular, 90% range in Russia. And he's gaining popularity in the European Union and the other countries in Europe that basically see him as a possible answer, an alternative answer to the standard American diktat through NATO formulation.
I think it's possible that he's even gaining in popularity here, because I mean, I think there's a lot of people that are weary of American intervention overseas, and when he's talking about that he's, whether it's true or whether it's not, that he's going in to fight ISIS, that he's worried about ISIS, well, that's probably one of our biggest threats, if not the biggest threat that we actually face on there's a reason why we get checked at airports.
Yeah.
There's a reason why people check our phones.
Yeah.
And it's not because of Russia. It's not because of, it's because of groups like ISIS. Yeah. And so when somebody's talking about fighting somebody like that, it's going to resonate with people that are a little bit tired of that.
I think it's important to realize that we've always had a push-pull relationship with the Russians. Way back in Archangel in 1903, 1905, we helped them And then we tried to help the white Russians against the red Russians. And we have a replete history of assistance and confrontation. Détente confrontation. That's most of my writing is centered around that thematic issue. And I think what we're looking at here is that I think the Obama administration may finally come to the realization, you know, we say some harsh things to each other, but we still have some common interests. We can make common cause. Both of us want to get rid of ISIS and the other radical Islamics.
I think it's an interesting situation where you have two leaders, or two leaders especially, and a lot of people sort of portray Obama as rather soft, but I think in diplomacy especially, the sort of now famous video of them shaking hands, which is the most coldest handshake I think I've ever seen, they both look tough. It doesn't seem like Obama doesn't appear to be being bullied in any way. Putin certainly doesn't appear, he never appears if he's being bullied. So I think when you have two leaders like that, the possibility for them getting stuff done, even though, because there's really no sort of big dog on the block, so to speak, the possibilities I think are ripe for, I mean, obviously anything can happen, but for rapprochement,
I think they can deal with each other.
Yeah.
They get past the polemics and the stagecraft.
Yeah.
And they say, you know, where are the solutions? Well, it's right in front of me, you and me.
Well, I think there's outside actors though too that'll prevent that.
Absolutely.
You know, where there's other countries in that region that are not going to allow those two to do certain things.
And I think you made a good point about ISIS and how they are sort of an existential threat to everybody. You know, it's been a while since we've had a sort of unifying cause.
Well, the last time was GWAT, when the Bush administration cooperated with the same man, Putin, against Islamic radicals in the U.S., in the Russian Federation, and also throughout the world. There was a major work that they did together after 9/11. We have to remember, after 9/11, the first call that Bush got was from Vladimir Putin. What can we do to help? And I think there's still some residual goodwill there, despite our current issues over Ukraine.
If we could move, that's really interesting stuff. If we could move sort of on the same topic, but to broaden it a little bit, to involve other hostile actors, if we could, Iran. We just found out that the Russians and the Iranians and the Iraqis have decided to join intelligence sharing with a command center in Iraq.
It's in Iraq.
And they did not include us. I guess what does that mean?
Well, the Abadi government, they ousted Maliki, or he was asked to go, and he did, and al-Abadi took over. And he's been very low profile, very quiet. And I think the Obama administration has tried to stand off from re-engagement, other than in an advisory capacity and only reactively to ISIS. So there's common cause there. But when we get shown the door, the diplomatic door, and say, we'll take care of this, Vladimir Putin and the Iranian, Soleimani, and Abadi, and Assad, we'll take care of this, we don't need you. That's cause for alarm, because that's on the bigger chessboard that Dr. Winslow talks about. That gets into cybernetics. So if we're being excluded from the big game, that's a concern.
Is it a trust issue, do you think? Do you think the Iraqis have lost faith in us?
Most of this is covert action. And so what we're reading in the paper is the tip of the iceberg. Everything that you don't hear is what's really going on. And that's something that's hard to explain, especially to a viewing audience that don't have experience with these matters. But I read the New York Times International section every day. I've been doing it for 30 years to prep for my classes. And the one thing that they're very good about is staying up to the moment, which is real time. I'd say within 12 hours of real time. So that's the reason it's valuable to me. And what I'm getting the drift of is that the Obama administration may be looking at it this way. If the Russians can solve this, let's let them.
Especially as compared.
Smart move.
And maybe as compared to for example, under the Bush administration, second Bush administration, it was sort of, if there's a problem, we have to solve it. So this is sort of a shift in philosophy with the Obama administration.
Very subtle, but very dramatic and important shift. Because if we can mature as a democracy and cede responsibility, we don't have to lead every action. Every action doesn't have to be kinetic. we can use it because Obama is a diplomat. He takes a diplomatic approach first, but he also has kinetics because he backs up the drone strikes, JSOC. He does everything covertly as far as action goes. So yeah, I think it's time for more of a, let's let the other guy do it.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that if it works, if it serves their purpose, even if it looks like bandwagoning.
Yeah.
It serves, it makes, if it gets the job done, then that's the objective.
It's more pragmatic.
Yeah, more pragmatic, exactly.
Well, that will do it for this evening's talk. I'd like to thank Keith Palmer and Dr. Winslow. I'm sorry, Dr. Simmons.
Thank you for calling me that. That's a compliment.
That's
Thank you.
for being with me tonight. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. Once again, please visit the SimmonsReview.com. There's a plethora of articles and videos on there to help educate our viewers and readers about the current international issues. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.